At 02:11 a.m. on September 24, 1944, deep behind German lines near the Dutch town of Nijmegen, a single American paratrooper keyed his radio and reported that his position was still secure. That transmission should not have been possible. Operation Market Garden was already unraveling. The airborne landings had succeeded only partially. German counterattacks were faster and more coordinated than expected. Drop zones were scattered. Units were fragmented. Communications failed repeatedly. Small groups of paratroopers found themselves isolated within hours, cut off from both ground forces and each other. The man transmitting that message was not part of a functioning unit anymore. He had been separated from his platoon during the initial drop. His radio operator was dead. His ammunition was low. He was holding a damaged stone farmhouse overlooking a narrow road used by German vehicles moving north toward the bridges. According to airborne doctrine, isolated troopers in that situation were expected to evade, break contact, and attempt to rejoin friendly forces. Holding ground alone, at night, with no support, violated every assumption built into the plan. Yet the position remained in American hands. By sunrise, German patrols had attempted to clear the farmhouse 3 times. All 3 attempts failed. The road remained unusable. Movement toward the bridge was delayed long enough for other Allied units to reposition. When U.S. forces finally re-entered the area 2 days later, they found the farmhouse shattered by small arms fire and grenades. Inside were 1 exhausted paratrooper, 2 wounded German soldiers taken prisoner, and a defensive position improvised from furniture, rubble, and ammunition boxes. No reinforcement had arrived. No orders had been received. No one had known he was still there. In after-action summaries, the delay along that road was attributed to localized resistance. No name was attached. No explanation was given for how resistance had been maintained by a single man against repeated probes. From a distance, the outcome appears minor. A short delay. A brief disruption. 1 farmhouse among many. From the inside, the outcome depended on whether one man could remain functional while everything designed to support him had already failed. This is not a story about bravery in isolation. It is a story about how survival, once separated from command and doctrine, becomes a matter of managing space, time, and exhaustion, minute by minute, until the situation changes or the body gives out. The area north of Nijmegen in late September 1944 was a patchwork of low farmland, narrow roads, drainage ditches, and small villages built around stone houses and barns. Unlike the open terrain planners had emphasized in briefings, the ground favored close-range movement and concealment. Visibility at night was limited not by distance, but by obstruction. The farmhouse occupied by the paratrooper stood at a slight bend in a narrow road bordered by hedgerows and shallow canals. The structure itself was solid, built from thick stone with a low roof and small windows. It had been designed to retain heat and withstand weather, not gunfire. But its layout created natural choke points, narrow doorways, tight stairwells, and limited lines of approach. Weather conditions favored neither side. Night temperatures dropped close to freezing. Moisture from nearby canals produced low fog that settled unevenly. Sound carried unpredictably. Footsteps on gravel could be heard at long range, while voices sometimes vanished into damp air. German units operating in the area were moving aggressively to reassert control over road networks leading to the Wall River crossings. Infantry patrols preceded armored elements, probing for resistance and clearing isolated Allied positions before vehicles advanced. Speed mattered. Delays accumulated quickly. For the paratrooper inside the farmhouse, the terrain eliminated maneuver. There was nowhere to withdraw without exposure. Fields were open. Ditches provided concealment, but little protection. Any movement outside the structure would be visible at dawn and audible at night. Ammunition was limited to what he carried during the jump and what he could recover from abandoned equipment nearby. There was no resupply. Medical supplies were minimal. Food was whatever could be found inside the house. Communication was effectively non-existent. The radio functioned intermittently, with damaged components and low battery power. Each transmission risked detection and reduced the chance of further contact. The environment imposed constraints that simplified decision-making while increasing risk. Movement attracted attention. Noise invited attack. Stillness conserved energy, but surrendered initiative. The farmhouse offered protection only as long as it remained unpredictable to those approaching it. The setting did not reward aggression. It rewarded restraint, timing, and the ability to endure long periods of inaction followed by sudden violence. The paratrooper's name was Corporal Daniel Reeves, 22 years old, assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. Before the war, he grew up in rural Kentucky, where isolation was normal rather than exceptional. His family lived miles from the nearest town. Repairs were done by necessity, not convenience. Waiting out bad weather was routine. Reeves had worked as a part-time carpenter before enlisting. He understood structures intuitively, where weight traveled, which walls bore load, which corners absorbed force. During training, he showed no exceptional marksmanship or leadership qualities. His instructors described him as steady, quiet, and observant. He was not selected for airborne duty because of aggression. He was selected because he followed instructions precisely and remained functional under stress. His jump training reflected that. He did not rush exits. He did not panic when things went wrong. He corrected problems methodically. During the drop over the Netherlands, Reeves landed hard and far from his assigned rally point. His ankle was bruised. His weapon survived intact. Nearby, he found the body of his radio operator and salvaged what equipment he could carry. By nightfall, he realized that movement toward friendly forces was blocked by German patrols. Reeves did not frame the situation as heroic or desperate. He framed it as temporary. His decisions were shaped less by ideology than by habit. He secured shelter. He controlled entrances. He reduced noise. He tracked time. His background did not prepare him for combat in isolation. It prepared him for endurance without certainty. That distinction mattered once the farmhouse became his entire world, and survival depended on treating each hour as manageable rather than terminal. By the time German patrols first approached the road, Reeves had already transformed the building from shelter into a position, one that relied not on firepower, but on control of space and uncertainty. The moment that followed would test not his courage, but whether ordinary discipline could substitute for a system that was no longer present. Operation Market Garden was built on a sequence of tightly linked assumptions. Airborne forces would seize key bridges. Ground forces would advance rapidly along a narrow corridor. German resistance would be disorganized long enough for speed to compensate for risk. Each part of the system depended on the others functioning on schedule. For an airborne rifleman like Corporal Daniel Reeves, the system was supposed to provide structure even in chaos. After landing, scattered troopers were expected to rally, consolidate into platoon or company-sized elements, and either hold objectives or move aggressively toward them. Isolation was considered temporary. Doctrine assumed that mobility and initiative would reconnect units quickly. The farmhouse position Reeves occupied was never intended to be held. Airborne doctrine emphasized movement over static defense. Light infantry without heavy weapons was not supposed to defend fixed structures against repeated attacks. Doing so risked encirclement, ammunition depletion, and eventual capture. The system also assumed functional communications. Radio nets linked platoons to company commanders who coordinated fires, movements, and requests for support. Even when radios failed, runners or visual signals were expected to bridge gaps. Reeves had none of those options. His radio was damaged. His unit was gone. No one knew his exact location. Logistics were equally fragile. Airborne troops carried limited ammunition by design. Resupply depended on timely airdrops or rapid link-up with ground forces. Market Garden's delays and German counterattacks disrupted both. Reeves's ammunition load was finite, and every round expended reduced future choices. Fire support was non-existent. Artillery and armor were the responsibility of ground forces advancing north. Air support was constrained by weather, confusion over friendly positions, and the speed of German movement. Reeves could expect no indirect fire, no close air support, and no armored relief. The system was not incompetent. It was optimized for momentum. Once momentum was lost, its margins vanished quickly. For Reeves, that meant doctrine offered no solution. Manuals did not explain how to hold a farmhouse alone against repeated probing attacks. Training emphasized what to do as part of a force, not how to remain effective when the force disappeared. What remained was the smallest operational unit imaginable: one man, one weapon, and a structure that could be adapted. Reeves was no longer executing a plan. He was managing failure, deciding which parts of the system could still be simulated and which had to be abandoned entirely. The decisive moment came just before midnight on the first night. Reeves heard movement along the road, boots on gravel, low voices, the clink of equipment. A German patrol was approaching the farmhouse from the south. At that moment, Reeves had two viable options. The first was to disengage. He could abandon the farmhouse under cover of darkness, move through the fields and ditches, and attempt to evade toward Allied lines. This option aligned with airborne doctrine. It preserved his life at the cost of relinquishing the position. The risks were immediate: open ground, uncertain enemy strength, and a wounded ankle that slowed movement. The second option was to stay. Holding the farmhouse would delay German movement along the road. It would provide a defensible position with limited avenues of approach. It also meant committing to a fight that could not be sustained indefinitely. Ammunition would run out. Detection would increase. Escape later would be harder. Reeves chose to stay. The decision was not framed as sacrifice or defiance. It was framed as probability. Movement through open terrain carried a high chance of immediate contact. Remaining inside the farmhouse allowed Reeves to control when and how contact occurred. The building reduced angles of approach. Darkness favored the defender. Once that decision was made, alternatives narrowed rapidly. Reeves committed to static defense not because it was ideal, but because it was the least bad option available in that moment. He accepted that the choice would have consequences later. The moment passed without ceremony. Reeves adjusted his position, checked his weapon, and waited. From that point on, survival depended on how well he could manage space, sound, and fatigue within the confines of the farmhouse. Reeves's first priority was to shape the interior of the farmhouse to his advantage. Furniture was moved to block secondary entrances. Narrow corridors were left unobstructed to channel movement. Windows were partially covered, leaving small observation gaps that limited silhouettes while preserving visibility. He established a rotation of positions rather than staying in one place. After any movement or noise outside, Reeves shifted location to prevent pattern recognition. Predictability was avoided even at the cost of comfort. He accepted that sleep would be fragmented and shallow. Ammunition management became deliberate. Reeves fired only when he was confident of effect. Shots were aimed, not suppressive. Each engagement was designed to create uncertainty rather than casualties. German patrols were allowed to withdraw rather than be pursued. The goal was deterrence, not annihilation. Noise discipline was constant. Reeves padded loose equipment with cloth. He timed his movements with ambient sounds, wind, distant vehicles, or gunfire elsewhere, to mask his own. Silence became as important as firepower. Light was avoided entirely. Reeves navigated by memory and touch. Matches and flashlights were reserved for emergencies. Darkness preserved concealment and distorted the enemy's perception of the building's occupancy. Fatigue was managed through forced pauses. Reeves allowed himself brief periods of stillness, leaning against walls or sitting on stairs without removing equipment. These moments were short but essential. Complete exhaustion would eliminate judgment, and judgment was his primary advantage. When German soldiers approached the farmhouse, Reeves engaged selectively. Grenades were used sparingly, only when patrols reached points of no retreat. Each explosion served a psychological purpose as much as a tactical one, suggesting more defenders than actually existed. As hours turned into days, Reeves's world contracted to sound, timing, and restraint. Survival was no longer about fighting well. It was about delaying detection, conserving energy, and remaining unpredictable long enough for external conditions to change. By the end of the second night, Reeves was no longer thinking in terms of objectives or escape. He was managing a balance between presence and absence, action and inaction, that allowed the farmhouse to remain American-controlled despite the absence of any system that was supposed to make that possible. By the third night, the cost of holding the farmhouse became cumulative rather than episodic. There were no dramatic turning points, only a steady narrowing of margins. Reeves's ankle had swollen to the point where weight-bearing produced sharp pain. He compensated by limiting movement to short, deliberate shifts, favoring positions that required minimal repositioning. Sleep deprivation began to affect perception. Sounds blended together. The distinction between distant movement and imagined noise required conscious effort. Reeves countered this by imposing routine. He checked entrances in a fixed order. He counted steps between positions. He marked time not by hours, but by repeated actions that anchored awareness. Ammunition levels fell below what doctrine would consider viable. Reeves separated remaining rounds by type and accessibility, prioritizing reliability over volume. Magazines with questionable feed were set aside. Grenades were kept within arm's reach, but never carried simultaneously. Losing one to a mishap would be irreversible. The interior of the farmhouse showed the strain. Furniture splintered from earlier impacts. Glass lay scattered across floors. Dust and smoke lingered in confined spaces, irritating eyes and lungs. Reeves limited movement through debris to reduce noise and conserve energy. Contact continued intermittently. German patrols probed, withdrew, returned from different angles. Reeves did not attempt to dominate these encounters. He aimed to shape them, forcing hesitation, encouraging caution, and suggesting resistance that exceeded reality. Each successful deterrence extended time, but also increased scrutiny. Physiological stress compounded. Hunger dulled concentration. Dehydration thickened saliva and slowed reaction. Reeves rationed what little food he found inside the house, accepting discomfort to preserve function. Pain was managed through positioning rather than medication. There was nothing to spare. The most significant consequence was psychological compression. Reeves's world narrowed to a few rooms and a strip of road outside. Larger objectives ceased to matter. Survival depended on maintaining coherence, keeping decisions proportional, avoiding impulsive action, and recognizing when restraint mattered more than aggression. He remained alive. He remained in control. But the cost was measured in exhaustion, injury, and the steady erosion of options. The end did not arrive with a final assault. It arrived with absence. German movement along the road diminished. Engine sounds shifted farther away. Patrols ceased to test the farmhouse directly. Reeves did not interpret this as safety. He maintained posture, waited, and conserved what remained. When American forces re-entered the area, they did so cautiously. The corridor had been contested repeatedly. Movement was deliberate. Reeves identified friendly forces only after confirming uniform details, call and response, and proximity. Even then, he did not expose himself immediately. Extraction was uneventful by combat standards and profound by human ones. Reeves was assisted out of the farmhouse, unable to walk unassisted. The building was inspected and dismissed as tactically minor. The delay along the road was noted, then folded into broader timelines. At higher levels, the incident produced no doctrinal revision. Market Garden's outcomes were assessed at scale. Individual anomalies were absorbed without emphasis. The system acknowledged the delay and moved on. Medical evaluation documented Reeves's injuries, sprains, exposure, exhaustion. Recovery was partial and uneven. He did not return to airborne operations. His role in the delay was never highlighted publicly, nor was it required to be. Among soldiers in nearby units, the story circulated briefly, stripped of specifics, a reference point rather than a lesson. Proof that isolation did not always end immediately, and that restraint could be as decisive as firepower. The farmhouse still stands, altered by time and repair, its wartime damage long since absorbed into newer layers of stone and wood. There is no indication of what occurred there, no plaque or marker to separate those nights from any other. On paper, the delay was minor. A few hours, a narrow road, a footnote in an operation defined by larger failures and limited successes. What the records do not capture is how survival unfolded without reinforcement, without orders, and without certainty. How it depended on managing sound, space, fatigue, and restraint rather than decisive action. The outcome was not created by doctrine, but by the careful abandonment of it when doctrine no longer applied. Reeves did not hold because he was told to, or because he expected recognition. He held because staying made sense 1 hour at a time, because leaving was worse, and because discipline persisted after support disappeared. If carefully researched stories like this, quiet, factual, and grounded in the realities of war, matter to you, consider subscribing to the channel to support our team and help ensure these histories continue to be told.